When a retired trucker faces eviction, abandoned by the company he once served, he prepares to lose everything. But what he doesn't know is that the road he paved years ago is about to lead dozens of trucks straight to his doorstep. How far will loyalty travel? The morning sun spilled through the crooked blinds, casting thin bars of light across the old kitchen table. James sat quietly in the same seat he'd occupied for years, a chipped ceramic mug warming his calloused hands. Outside the window, the once proud Mack truck sat beneath a thin veil of mist, its faded red paint peeling, wheels sunken into the overgrown grass. The chrome grille, once polished to a mirror shine, now reflected nothing but rust and dust. He took a slow sip of coffee, his gaze lingering on the truck as if waiting for it to roar back to life on its own. But it didn't. It hadn't in years. The house creaked as he stood, bones stiff from the lingering injuries that never quite healed right. His right leg ached, a dull throb that had become part of him since the accident. He stepped outside onto the porch, the wooden boards groaning beneath his weight. A cold breeze carried the scent of rain and diesel, though no trucks passed on the nearby highway this early. He squinted at the mailbox nailed to the fence. The envelope was there, wedged between ads and bills, a thick, official-looking letter. He knew what it was before he even opened it. He walked down the steps slowly, pulling it free. The bank's logo was stamped in bold across the top. He didn't need to read it, but he did anyway. 7 days. That's all he had left before they came for the house. 7 days before everything he'd built, every memory tied to these walls and that old truck, would be auctioned off, bulldozed, or forgotten. James folded the letter neatly, tucking it into his back pocket. He glanced at the truck again, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Guess we're both out of time," he muttered under his breath. A few miles down the highway, a young driver named Liam pulled his rig into a roadside gas station, its flickering neon sign humming against the pale morning light. He stretched his arms, rolling the stiffness from his shoulders as the fuel pump clicked away. His eyes wandered absently over the fields beyond the station until something caught his attention. There, just past a cluster of trees, an old farmhouse stood weathered but stubborn, and beside it, half hidden in the tall grass, was the unmistakable silhouette of a rusted Mack truck, its red paint dulled by years but its lines still proud. "Damn, that's an old Mack," Liam murmured, admiring the silhouette. Something about it tugged at him, a familiarity he couldn't quite place. Inside the station, he chatted with the attendant, an older man reading the local paper behind the counter. "Hey, whose truck's that down the road?" "The old red one by that farmhouse," Liam asked, jerking his thumb toward the window. The man looked up, squinting through his glasses. That's James's place. James Harrison. Used to be an instructor down at the driving school back in the day. Taught half the county how to drive an 18-wheeler. He shook his head softly. He's had it rough since that wreck a few years back. Word is he's about to lose the house. Liam's brow furrowed. The name stirred something in him. James Harrison. Uncle Ray had mentioned him before. "Wait, Harrison? He taught my uncle, Ray Simmons. He used to talk about him all the time." The attendant chuckled. "That right? Small world." "Yeah, Harrison was a legend around here. Didn't just teach people how to drive, he taught 'em how to survive out there. Gave folks confidence. Hell, some of 'em owe their careers to him." Liam looked back out the window, a strange heaviness settling in his chest. "And now he's losing everything?" "Looks that way." The man sighed. "Company blamed him for that accident. Never sat right with me. He tried to fight it, but you know how those corporate types are. He's been quiet ever since." Liam didn't say anything for a long moment. His gaze lingered on the distant figure of James, still standing alone on the porch, looking at the truck like it held all the answers he'd never gotten. Back at the farmhouse, James walked toward the truck, running a weathered hand along the hood. His fingers traced the outline of old decals, peeling letters that once spelled out Harrison and Sons. Sons. He hadn't been blessed with any. Just a daughter who'd moved away years ago, chasing a different kind of life. The door creaked as he pulled it open, revealing a faded cab filled with memories. A worn-out logbook, a Polaroid of his daughter as a little girl tucked into the visor, a CB radio that hadn't crackled to life in a decade. He climbed in slowly, inhaling the lingering scent of grease, old leather, and 1,000 miles of stories. He sat behind the wheel, resting his hands on it as if greeting an old friend. His eyes closed for a moment, imagining the engine rumbling beneath him, the road stretching out like a ribbon toward the horizon. But the silence returned, heavy and final. Liam stood at the edge of the property now, having walked from the station. He hesitated before calling out, "Mr. Harrison?" James looked up, startled but not unfriendly. "Yeah." Liam stepped closer, offering a respectful nod. "Sorry to bother you, sir. Name's Liam Simmons. My uncle, Ray Simmons, said you taught him years ago." A flicker of recognition lit James's eyes. "Ray? He's your uncle?" His lips curved into a tired smile. "Good man. Solid driver." "Yeah. He always said you were the best teacher he ever had," Liam replied sincerely. "I saw your truck from the road. Couldn't help but stop. She's a beauty, even with the rust." James chuckled softly. "She had her day. Don't know what'll happen to her now. Or to me, for that matter." Liam hesitated. "If you don't mind me asking, what really happened with the accident?" James's smile faded slightly, gaze drifting back toward the distant hills. "It wasn't supposed to go like that," he said quietly. "Brakes failed on a downhill grade. Should have been a recall. But the company, they said it was driver error. Didn't want the bad press. I tried to fight it. Couldn't afford the lawyers they had." He sighed, rubbing his temple. "I gave him 30 years. And in the end, they gave me nothing." Liam's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone. "Would you mind if I looked into something? I've got some friends online who know their way around DOT records. Might be nothing, but—" James raised a brow. "Son, you don't owe me anything." "I know," Liam said quietly. "But maybe it's time somebody did." James regarded him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Do what you gotta do." As Liam walked back toward the station, already typing furiously on his phone, James leaned back in the cab, staring at the faded Polaroid of his daughter smiling at him from years ago. He closed his eyes, listening to the silence, waiting for the sound of an engine that never came. But somewhere, far off in the distance, the road had already begun to stir. The hum of the laptop filled the small apartment as Liam stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He'd spent the past hour crafting the post, carefully choosing every word. It wasn't just a message, it was a tribute, a call for recognition. He clicked post. The story of James Harrison, the veteran trucker forced into retirement after an unfair blame, was now out in the world. Alongside the story, Liam had uploaded a photo. James standing proudly in front of his old red Mac, a quiet strength in his posture, the creases around his eyes telling 1,000 miles of stories. Within minutes, the notifications started rolling in. "I remember this man. He trained me back in Ohio 2008. One of the best instructors I ever had. James Harrison? I owe my life to the defensive driving tricks he drilled into us. Saved me in a blizzard on I-80. This man deserves better." Sharing this everywhere, the story spread like wildfire. Truckers across the country, men and women parked at truck stops, waiting at loading docks, resting in sleeper cabs, read the post on their phones between deliveries. Some hadn't thought of James in years, but now, his name stirred something deep inside them. Memories surfaced, lessons replayed, gratitude rekindled. In a trucker forum with over 50,000 members, a thread under Liam's post grew rapidly. "He's the reason I didn't quit during training. James used to stay late to help us practice backing up into docks. Nobody else did that. He bought me lunch every single day when I couldn't afford it." Stories piled up, each one weaving into the next. A patchwork quilt of lives quietly touched by a man who never sought recognition. And far away from the noise of the internet, James Harrison sat alone at his kitchen table, completely unaware. A thin envelope lay on the table before him, official and cold. He opened it with steady hands, though he already knew what it contained. Final notice, it read. 7 days until the bank reclaimed the property. 7 days left in the only home he'd known since hanging up his keys. He folded the letter neatly, setting it beside a stack of other unopened envelopes. Then, he reached for a dusty shoebox at the corner of the table and pulled it closer. Inside were photographs, faded and curling at the edges. Pictures of Anna as a child sitting in the passenger seat. Snapshots of old trucking buddies, smiling at truck stops. A younger James posing in front of his first rig, holding a freshly earned CDL. He traced his thumb over each photo, pausing at one of his training classes. 20 young faces, eager and uncertain, standing in front of the truck. He could remember each name. He could still hear their voices. A soft knock at the door interrupted his quiet sorting. James stood slowly and opened it to find his neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, holding a covered dish. "Thought you could use some hot casserole," she said kindly. "Thank you, Helen," James replied, managing a tired smile. "You holding up okay?" she asked, glancing past him into the dim kitchen. "Doing what I can," James said. "Appreciate you checking in. Well, if you need anything, holler." She patted his arm gently. "You're not alone, James." He nodded, watching her walk back down the porch steps. But as the door closed behind him, the house felt heavier. The silence crept back in. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, a man named Mark sat in the office of his growing logistics company. His assistant had forwarded him a link with a simple message. "Isn't this your old instructor?" Mark clicked it, and there on his screen was the photo of James. Older now, but unmistakable. Mark leaned back in his chair, memories flooding in. He could see himself again. Nervous, broke, 22 years old, sitting in James's classroom, wondering if he'd ever belong behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. He remembered the day he almost quit, walking out of the training yard, too embarrassed to face another failed maneuver. And he remembered James calling him over, pulling out his wallet, and quietly handing him a folded bill. "Go renew that permit, Mark. I believe in you," James had said. "And when you make it out there, you pass it forward." Mark's throat tightened. He had never forgotten that moment. Never forgotten that $100 bill, the money that bought him one more chance. The chance that changed his entire life. Mark picked up his phone, his decision already made. "Rachel," he said into the receiver, his voice firm, "get me a list of our trucking partners. I want everyone on a conference call tonight. We've got work to do." "Work, sir?" Mark looked back at the screen, at James's steady eyes in the photograph. "We're going to help an old friend," Mark said, "and we're going to make sure the road gives him something back." And as night fell across highways and truck stops, conversations rippled through phone lines and private messages. A plan was quietly forming, like engines warming up before dawn. And back in his quiet kitchen, James Harrison sat with a stack of old photos, unaware that the wheels of something bigger than himself had already begun to turn. James woke early that morning, stirred not by the usual creaks of the old house, but by something else, something unfamiliar. He lay still, listening. A low hum carried through the morning air, faint at first, then growing louder. Not the sound of wind, nor the rumble of passing cars. It was deeper, rhythmic, almost like thunder rolling across the plains. He pushed himself up from bed, wincing at the familiar ache in his back. Pulling a jacket over his worn t-shirt, he stepped out onto the porch, blinking against the rising sun. And then he saw them. Over the crest of the distant hill, a line of headlights gleamed in the golden light. Trucks, dozens of them, big rigs, tankers, flatbeds, all shapes and sizes, crawling down the highway like an iron parade. The sound grew louder, engines roaring in harmony, horns blasting in a steady rhythm. A triumphant call that echoed across the quiet countryside. James gripped the porch railing, heart pounding. He stepped down the creaky steps, walking slowly toward the front gate as the trucks turned off the highway, tires crunching onto the dirt road that led to his yard. One by one, they pulled in, forming a semicircle around the old house. Engines idled, chrome reflecting sunlight, paint jobs gleaming under layers of road dust and pride. Doors opened. Drivers climbed down. Some young, some graying, faces weathered by miles and time. Men and women who'd driven across states, leaving their own routes and schedules behind. And every single one of them was here for him. James stood still, overwhelmed. He knew these faces. He had taught many of them to shift gears for the first time, had walked them through icy lot drills, had stayed late in the yard to make sure they passed their tests. And now they were here, standing before him, nodding, smiling, wiping at eyes they pretended weren't tearing up. Mark stepped forward, his boots kicking up dust as he approached, holding a folder in his hand. "You didn't think we'd forget you, old man," he said, voice rough with emotion. James swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "Mark? Look at you. You own your own company now." Mark smiled. "Yeah, been a long road since that first rig you let me practice on. Never forgot what you did for me, James. You lent me the money for my license when no one else would. Figured it's about time I paid that debt." He opened the folder, pulling out papers and handing them to James. "Debt's cleared. Title's safe. The bank's off your back." James stared at the documents, hands trembling. "You paid this?" Mark shook his head. "Not just me. We all did. Every one of us chipped in." He gestured around, and the drivers nodded, a quiet murmur of agreement passing through the group. Behind them, more drivers were unloading tools, setting up ladders, rolling out tarps. Someone was already scraping the rust off the old truck sitting in James's yard. Another group brought buckets of paint, replacement parts, and supplies. "Figured we'd give the old girl a shine too," Mark added, nodding toward the truck. "She's earned it. And so have you." James took a step back, tears welling in his eyes as he looked at the faces gathered before him. "I don't even know what to say," a young voice called out from behind the crowd. "Grandpa!" James turned, and there she was, Anna, his daughter, standing at the edge of the yard with her son in tow. She smiled, warmth shining in her eyes, her hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "We saw everything online. We had to come." James opened his arms, and she crossed the yard without hesitation, pulling him into a hug. Her son clung to his leg, beaming up at him. "It's been too long, Dad," Anna whispered. "I'm sorry it took this to bring us back." He held her tight, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. "You're here. That's what matters." Liam stepped up beside Mark, holding his phone toward James. "Thought you'd want to see this." James wiped his eyes, glancing at the screen. Headlines scrolled across. "Trucking company under investigation for negligence in brake failures." Articles piled up beneath. Reporters citing whistleblower reports, safety violations, corporate negligence. Justice wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy, but it was coming. James let out a long breath, standing straighter. He looked at Liam, at Mark, at the drivers gathered in his yard. "You all did this," he said softly. "Not just for me, but for every driver they wronged." Mark clapped him on the shoulder. "We learned from the best." And as the sun climbed higher, the engines rumbled again, a symphony of solidarity filling the air. Hammers struck metal, brushes swept on fresh paint, laughter echoed off the walls of the old house. And James didn't feel alone anymore. Home didn't feel like something he was losing. It felt like something they'd all rebuilt, together. By the next morning, the once quiet yard was alive with sound. Hammers rang against nails. Brushes swept long, steady strokes of fresh paint across weathered wood. Ladders leaned against the sides of the house, where volunteers patched old siding and replaced broken shutters. The fence that had sagged for years stood upright again, new boards shining under the sun. James stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, watching it all unfold with quiet wonder. Everywhere he looked, someone was helping. Drivers, neighbors, even strangers who had heard the story online and showed up with tools in hand. Laughter bubbled from the driveway, where a group debated over the best way to straighten a bent gate. Chatter floated from the backyard, where two women planted wildflowers along the fence line. In the center of it all sat his old truck, gleaming under layers of soap and polish. A team of mechanics worked around it, their sleeves rolled up, hands deep in the engine bay. Mark stood among them, clipboard in hand, pointing out replacement parts and explaining the plan. "We're gonna get her purring like she did 20 years ago, James," he called over. "Maybe better." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're all crazy," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, but his chest ached in the best way, filled with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Midday brought a new wave of visitors. A pair of news vans rolled up the dirt road, cameras and microphones already out. Reporters stepped onto the scene, interviewing drivers, filming the repairs, capturing shots of the convoy still parked like sentinels along the edge of the property. James wasn't one for the spotlight, but when a young reporter approached him with a mic, he smiled politely and nodded. "I'm just an old trucker," he said, his voice steady but humble. "Didn't think anyone'd care this much." The reporter beamed. "You've inspired a lot of people, Mr. Harrison. This is a story folks need right now." By late afternoon, the work had slowed, but the energy hadn't dimmed. Someone built a bonfire in the clearing near the barn, stacking logs high and lighting them as the sun began to dip. Folding chairs circled the flames. Coolers appeared, and hands passed around plates piled with food barbecue. Baked beans, cornbread, dishes shared from truck beds and tailgates. James sat near the fire, his grandson curled up beside him, head resting on his leg. Across the circle, drivers swapped stories, the kind only fellow truckers could appreciate. Tales of tight mountain passes, black ice scares, impossible delivery deadlines, and the small victories that kept them going mile after mile. Mark raised a beer bottle in a quiet toast. "To James," he said simply, "for teaching us the road, and showing us what it means to never give up." A ripple of cheers followed. James lifted his coffee mug in return, smiling softly, his eyes shining under the flicker of firelight. Later, as the fire crackled low and the stars blinked awake overhead, Mark pulled up a chair beside him. "James," he began, his tone thoughtful, "I've been thinking, you've still got more to give." James tilted his head, curious. "I want you to come work with me," Mark continued. "Not behind a wheel unless you want to, but as head of driver training and recruitment. Teach the next generation. Build the team. Shape the future of the company." James's eyebrows rose. "You serious?" Mark grinned. "Dead serious. You've been a mentor to all of us already. Might as well make it official. And you can set your own hours. No long hauls, no pressure. Just sharing what you know." James let the offer settle in his chest, a quiet pride swelling inside. That's something I never expected," he admitted. Mark clapped his shoulder. "You earned it, James. Every mile." Across the circle, Liam approached, hands in his pockets, hesitating before speaking. "Mr. Harrison," he said shyly, "would you consider mentoring me? I've learned so much already just being here, but I want to learn from the best." James looked at him, then at the drivers gathered around, and finally at his grandson's sleeping face. He nodded slowly, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, kid, I'd be honored." The next morning, the trucks lined up once again, engines rumbling softly as they prepared to roll out. James stood by the gate, his grandson perched on his hip, waving proudly as each driver honked goodbye. Mark's truck idled last, window rolled down. "See you Monday, boss," he called with a wink. James laughed. "Don't be late," he shot back. When the final rig disappeared over the hill, James turned back toward the house. His grandson tugged at his sleeve. "Grandpa," the boy asked eagerly, "can I ride in the big truck someday?" James crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Not just someday," he said, pointing toward the freshly restored rig in the yard. "We'll start today." He opened the passenger door and lifted his grandson inside, settling him into the seat. The boy's eyes widened as he took in the dashboard, the wheel, the view. James climbed in beside him, running a hand across the steering wheel, feeling the hum of possibility in his bones. "Ready for the road ahead, kiddo?" he asked softly. The boy nodded, grinning wide. "Ready, Grandpa." James started the engine, the familiar rumble filling his chest like a heartbeat. He looked out at the yard, the house no longer crumbling, the fences standing proud, the laughter still echoing from the night before. James wasn't looking back anymore, and the road at last was giving back. This story reminds us, sometimes, the roads we travel come back to carry us home. What would you do if an entire convoy showed up at your door? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this journey moved you, hit like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories, right here on Embrace the Journey.